Hello everyone, welcome to the lecture 28 of week 6. This is Dripta and the title of today's lecture is Introducing Minimalism. So, we have been doing syntax for last few classes. In today's class we will wrap up the discussion of syntax and the last class will be talking about the idea of minimalism. So, these are the targets for today's class. We will be talking about the basic idea of minimalist approach, then we will be talking about the economy principle, the idea of last resort interfaces and a few more concepts related to the minimalist approach, and finally, we will be talking about the idea of features in minimalism. So, we already know that there is this idea of transformational generative grammar, and the first point on the slide says that minimalism is the latest development of transformational generative grammar. So, I have taken from Blasnik's work. So, there are, as I told you, there are different revisions in Chomskyan theory, and minimalism is considered as the latest and most important development in contemporary syntactic theory. And it is an approach where basically we talk about how human language works like the other approaches, but there is something very special about minimalism. It says that the computational system is the perfect solution for relating sound and meaning. For last few classes we were talking about the fact that we need to relate sound and meaning, and not only the last few classes, even in the beginning part of this course we did talk about this fact. If you remember that in linguistics we do talk about the relation of sound and meaning, the pair, sound meaning pair, which is a very basic idea of the discipline. So, minimalism says that the computational system is the perfect solution. So, we also talked about computational system. We know that we consider the linguistic system as a computational system, but the perfect idea is the new idea, and we have to remember this because this is a key concept of minimalist approach. And we should also know that this is a simpler model. So, we have been talking about GB, the government and binding theory, in the last class, and basically minimalism developed after the GB. So, it is simpler than even GB. We did say that in GB things are becoming simpler, but in minimalism things are becoming more simple. And there are certain reduction of the number of levels of representation in the model. We will see how, and also there is deduction of constraints on syntactic derivation. So, we know that there are certain levels of representation that we discussed. It will be, the number will be reduced here, and also the constraints of syntactic derivation. Now, you have some idea about the constraints, right, because we did talk about it briefly, and even that will be simpler. So, the knowledge of language questions are asked again in the minimalist program. These are the questions that Chomsky has been asking from the very beginning of his theories. So, how is the knowledge of language represented in human mind? This is the question that we have been asking from the very beginning of the course. Even through the minimalist approach, this question is addressed. And here competence is a computational system. I hope you remember what competence is. It is the knowledge of language. So, we devoted one entire class talking about competence, the idea of competence, and also the distinction between competence and performance, if you remember. So, in this model, competence is basically the computational system where derivations produce structural representation. So, I will ask you to be a little careful about the terminologies and the explanation in which we are explaining the system in a newer way. So, that will be useful for us. So, competence is a computational system where derivations produce structural representation. So, if you ask questions about the individuals, because when we talked about the knowledge of language, we did talk about individuals, right. So, we are saying that the computational system is innate. following the innateness hypothesis that we already know, and we are saying here that particular lexical items are learned. The computational system is actually innate, that is a most important part of this approach. And the economic criteria is another key aspect of the minimalist program, where we can basically highlight this part. So, what is this economic criteria? Economic criteria in a minimalist program says that derivations and representations constituting linguistic competence follow an economic criteria. So, what kind of economy that we will be seeing with a simple example, but we have to remember that we are talking about derivations and representations. So, and of course, we are talking about knowledge of language. So, we are talking about competence. So, what do we mean by this economic criteria? For example, there is no extra step in derivation. We will also talk about it briefly, and there is no extra symbols in representation. So, it is becoming a very simple model, as I said earlier, and that is why we have to follow the economic criteria. And we also will have no representations beyond the necessary ones. So, we will also try to see in terms of the previous models that we had discussed, how the previous models are differing here, and of course, it will differ in relation to the economic criteria. So, minimalism developed from GB, Government of Binding Theory, that you have briefly learned. We briefly discussed about it, and you can also say the principles and parameters model. So, in GB there are 4 different levels of representations. We did talk about the modules of GB, but as I told you, we will not discuss GB in detail. But now I will tell you that there are 4 different levels of representation related by derivation. So, let us go through them one by one, and we have to be careful. So, items from lexicon, you know what lexicon is. Items from lexicon are inserted into the D structure according to the syntactic properties and semantic roles. So, if you pay attention to syntactic properties, semantic roles, inserted, D structure and lexicon, you will realize that you have actually talked about all these, and you have some idea about all these, right. So, we did talk about C selection and S selection in the last class, the category selection and semantic selection, and you can here see that we are talking about syntactic properties and semantic roles. So, you can relate to these, right, syntactic properties, for example, the categories, and semantic roles, for example, the theta roles that we had discussed previously. So, we are saying here that items from lexicon are inserted into the D structure according to their syntactic properties and semantic roles. So, both syntactic properties and semantic roles are important, while the items are inserted into the D structure. You know, D structure is the underlying structure, and lexicons will be inserted into the D structure. That is the first step of the model. The next level of representation is saying that transformations alter the D structure and produce the S structure. I hope you also understand this, because we did talk about certain transformational rules previously. For example, the movement, if you remember. So, when we were talking about, for example, active and passive, we did talk about a movement of something, right. So, these movement transformations are basically altering the D structure and producing the S structure. The third point is that transformations continue the derivation from S structure to LF. Now, I will ask you to remember the simple diagram, which is this inverted Y diagram that I had shown previously. So, you can say that there is one branching going to LF and another branching going to PF. LF is logical form and PF is phonetic form. We have already learnt about it. So, transformation continue the derivation from S structure to LF, which is the logical form. The semantic concept is related to that, and phonological rules continue the derivation from S structure to PF. So, there are phonological rules which will be basically continuing the derivation from S structure to PF, which is another branching, if you remember. So, this is it was the idea that we got previously, and here we are saying that as human language is a way of relating sound and meaning, interface of PF and LF were considered as essential. So, we know we are again talking about the relation between sound and meaning, and that is why we earlier said that the interface of PF and LF will be essential. But minimalism is saying something simpler. Minimalism is saying that there is no other levels. The role of destructure is determining the transformation is insignificant. So, destructure is insignificant here, and also we will say that derived structure includes the destructure information. So, the derived structure will include the destructure information, and that is how the model is differing from the previous model. So, derivations proceed bottom up with the embedded structural units. So, you know it is why we are saying bottom up, because you know that different structural units are embedded and they are creating larger and larger units. That is something we discussed while talking about the phrase structure rules, if you remember, and how the phrase structure rules generate the syntactic trees. So, we basically create larger and larger units by embedding, and we are using the term bottom up here in order to talk about the hierarchical structure that we have already discussed. And you also know about the operation called merge. We say that merge operation is used and we create the IP, the inflectional phrase. You already know about IP, right. So, with the help of merge we create we try to embed units and then we create the sentence. So, in this model there is no one representation following lexical insertion and preceding all singularly transformations, as there is no destructure. So, this is something which is becoming a different one. So, now we can ask the following questions: is there a point where the derivation divides branching LF and PF, because we are saying that this model is different from the previous one. So, now the point is whether we will have the branching of LF and PF or we will not have it. So, minimalism says that the properties are the properties of LF. This is very important. Destructure information is already there and the properties are the properties of LF. And another goal of minimalism is to reduce constraints, as we have already pointed out. So, reduce constraints on representations to bare output conditions. So, we are talking about reduction of constraints as well. So, this is something we should remember. The constraints on transformational derivations are reduced to general principles of economy. We have to follow economy principle as we have seen previously, and the constraints on transformational derivations are reduced to general principles of economy. So, we will see an example and we will try to figure out whether we have understood the idea of economy principle or not. And here you can see that derivations beginning from the same numeration. So, please highlight the word numeration because it is an important concept again. We are talking about this idea of computational system and numeration is important for us. So, the same numeration are compared in terms of a number of steps, length of movement, etc. So, as we have to think about economic principle, we will say that the less economical ones are rejected. So, when we say that multiple items are available for WH movement in a language like English, the highest one will move. So, T is the trace here. If you see who will read what, the trace is there just after who. So, it is quite local, right. It is moving from a trace which is close to the position where which is actually occurring in the surface structure. So, you can say what will who read the trace, it is ungrammatical because it is a long move that we are trying to avoid. So, we call this a shortest move. So, as we have already mentioned, Chomsky said that human language faculty might be a computationally perfect solution to the problem of relating sound and meaning. So, computationally is one point, perfect is another point, and relating sound and meaning is the third point. So, we have to remember all three components, and overall it is a minimal computational system. So, let us also briefly talk about the idea called last resort in the nature of movement, though we did not explain the idea of movement, but we did talk about movement for various reasons, if you remember. So, here we are saying that movement must take place for a formal reason, and there are other conditions for movement in minimalism. For the advanced learners, I am sure you are familiar with them. We will not discuss that in detail, but we are saying that there are certain driving forces for the movement which should be satisfied immediately. So, it is again the operation move that we are discussing, but there should be certain kind of driving forces and which should be satisfied immediately. The driving force movement, we refer to it as greed. We can just know about the term, but we will not explain it. So, now I will quickly talk about a few concepts in minimalism which are important for us to know. Maybe it will be useful for other purpose in future, but we will just quickly go through them. So, the first one is procrastination. Why there is a delay in an operation until LF more economical than performing it earlier. So, when we were saying that it is the economic principle has to be followed, then we should also know about the idea of procrastination, and we will also talk about the difference between covert and overt syntax on one hand and strong and weak feature on the other hand. So, what is covert syntax? So, it is the portion of a derivation between a structure and LF. So, so called because transformational operations here have no phonetic effects. So, we are talking about the derivation between a structure and LF when we are referring to covert syntax. And what is overt syntax? The portion of a derivation between D structure and S structure. So, there are certain operations which take place in either overt or covert syntax. We will not talk about them, but it is important for us to know that the operations take place in different domains. And then we will also create a difference between strong feature versus weak feature. So, what is a strong feature? A property of a head requiring that something move to a position near it in overt syntax. So, this is a strong feature. So, we are again talking about movement in terms of some kind of feature. So, in the next part or last part of this class, I will be talking about the idea of feature. Then you can come back to this slide and go through the difference between strong and weak feature again. So, what is a weak feature? It is a property of a head requiring that something move to a position near it in covert syntax. So, basically we are talking about movements in overt or covert syntax, but these will be different, the movements will be different. So, it depends on the nature of the movement. And I will also quickly talk about interfaces. So, the relationship between syntactic derivation and semantic and phonological interfaces. Again we are coming back to the semantic and phonological component because these are related to the syntactic derivation, and you can see that in pre-GB or standard theory you had the idea of destructure where you had these interfaces. Then in GB you can say that there is this LF which happens via a structure, and in early minimalism we say it is via LF, which is an uninterrupted transformational derivation beginning with the numeration. So, now we will talk about the idea of features or the syntactic formatives. So, why am I trying to use this term syntactic formatives? So, if I ask you to talk about the idea of syntactic formatives, what are these? You can say that words are syntactic formatives, because when we were doing morphology, you understood that we create phrases and sentences with the help of words. So, can we say that syntactic formatives are the properties of words? Instead of saying words, we are now saying that no, words are not the syntactic formatives, but rather certain properties of words are syntactic formatives. These are like atoms, and there is an abstract idea that we are adopting again. The idea is morphosyntactic feature or simply feature. So, this is basically the property of words which are considered as formatives in syntax. So, a feature basically determines the shape of a word. So, I have a very simple example here, man is singular and men is plural. So, you can say that this is this feature which is determining the shape of the word here, and features that have an effect on semantic interpretation are called interpretable features, and there are something called uninterpretable features. They play a role when we build up a theory of syntax. So, semantic features are mostly considered as interpretable features, and syntactic features are mostly considered as uninterpretable features, but there can be certain changes as well. And there is this concept of feature bundles. The feature bundles are basically, they have morphological forms and semantic interpretations together, and features always have values. The values will be binary. For example, we can say that plus singular is for a singular noun and minus singular is applicable for a plural noun. So, we can write interface rules which maps from a syntactic structures consisting of features to a morphological and phonological structure, and on one hand there is a semantic interpretation. So, there are certain major category features like the word classes, you can say noun, verb, preposition, etc. These are word class features and these are major category features. And there are other features like the phi features, for example, person, number, gender. There can be case features like nominative, accusative, verbal features like aspect, and we should also know that languages may choose different sets of features from the universal pool of features. So, universal pool of features is very important. So, we have a pool of features, a number of features which is basically universal, but particular languages will select features which are necessary for that particular language. We will come back to this idea later when we will be discussing about certain differences. So, these features are bundled up with other features to create lexical items. So, we have a different way to define lexical items now. We can say that lexical items are basically bundles of different features. So, syntactic features are accessed by the operations of syntax. We did talk about operations like merge and move, and if you are willing to know, you can also talk about other kind of operations. And they for example, something called agree, if you are familiar with this operation called agree. And we are talking about this idea that they give birth to the particular patterns of words that we recognize as grammars. So, along with the operations that we have been discussing for last 2-3 classes or we have discussed previously, it is also important for us to know the features. So, if we have some idea of the features, the syntactic formatives and the operations, we will be able to figure out the nature of syntax. So, we are coming to the conclusion part of this class, and in today's class we talked about the idea of minimalism, and we say that it is minimalism is considered as a computational system which has a perfect solution for relating sound and meaning. Then we talked about economic conditions, and we said that derivations and economic conditions follow an economic criteria. And we said that the relation between syntactic derivation and semantic or phonological interfaces changed in different models. Finally, we talked about the idea of syntactic formatives, which are the features create the lexicon, and we need to understand the nature of features in order to understand the operations as a whole. So, these are the basic references. Thank you.